If you've ever tried to interrupt Nero Wolfe's morning routine, you'd better bring something bigger than an earthquake. From 9 to 11, he's locked in the plant rooms upstairs with his orchids, and I mean locked. Once, a delivery boy from the butcher's rang the bell 3 times in a row, and Wolfe suggested, later, over lunch, that I answer future interruptions by tossing a water bucket out the window. I decided he was only half kidding. That Tuesday started no different. Fritz was already fussing in the kitchen, and I was working through the morning mail in the office, which was dull enough to make me wonder if the U.S. postal system had outlawed bills and advertisements overnight. Wolfe was still with the orchids when the doorbell rang. Now, the usual parade of visitors to the brownstone divides neatly into 2 categories: people who think they want Wolfe's help and people who are already regretting asking. The man on the stoop didn't look like either. He was lean, polite, and carried a briefcase as though it were holding not documents but dynamite. He asked for Wolfe by name, and when I told him Wolfe wasn't receiving callers, he said, calm as Sunday school. It isn't exactly a case, it's an absence of one. That line earned him a seat in the front room while I went upstairs to disturb the master gardener. Wolfe grunted when I repeated it to him. He doesn't grunt often, and never without purpose. I dislike riddles before lunch, he said, but let him wait. I will descend at 11. At 11 sharp, Wolfe filled his oversized chair, glared at the visitor as if the man had been smuggled in against regulations, and said, "Proceed." Briefly. The man introduced himself as Lawrence Alcott, a clerk for a mid-tier publishing house over on Madison. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the kind of twitch that suggested he'd rehearsed every syllable. "There's been a murder," he said. "But there's no body. No crime scene. Not even a police report." I opened my notebook automatically. Wolfe closed his eyes, which in his case was a sign of attention, not dismissal. Alcott explained, a colleague of his, Caroline Day, an editor with a reputation sharp enough to cut paper, had disappeared 3 days earlier. She hadn't been reported missing. Her friends assumed she was traveling, the company assumed she was homesick, but Alcott swore she was dead. "On what basis?" Wolfe asked, his tone flat as a ruler. Alcott swallowed. "She told me so. In a letter now, I've heard stranger openers, but not by much." He reached into his briefcase and handed over a single envelope. I passed it to Wolfe, who slit it open with the precision of a man carving rare roast beef. The letter inside was short, handwritten, and chilling. Caroline Day had written, "By the time you read this, I will be dead, but you will not find me. They will not allow it." Wolfe's lips compressed. Mine didn't. "Who's they?" I asked. Alcott shook his head. "She didn't say. That's the problem. No one will even admit she's missing, but she is, Mr. Wolfe, and I can't—" He stopped there, gripping his knees like they might keep him from flying apart. I expected Wolfe to tell him to take it to the police. Instead, Wolfe leaned back, eyes hooded. "There is no body, no crime, and no client with authority to engage me," he said. "Yet you bring me this." "Yes." Alcott's voice cracked. "Because you're the only man in New York who could see through nothing, through absence." It was a lousy pitch, but I'll admit it had style. I glanced at Wolfe, his eyelids lowered, which for him was practically a cartwheel. "We shall see," Wolfe murmured. That was all. But I knew the case had already crossed the threshold of the brownstone, and Wolfe wasn't about to push it back out. If you've ever watched Nero Wolfe take an interest in something, you'll know it doesn't come with fireworks. There's no sudden leap from his chair, no shouted commands or triumphant declarations. What you get is a quiet shift in his breathing, a slight narrowing of his eyes, and then the rest of us are left to adjust to the gravitational pull of his attention. That's what happened after Lawrence Alcott dropped the letter in Wolfe's lap. By the time Wolfe murmured his "We shall see," I knew my day was ruined. Alcott sat there, twisting his hat like it was the last thing keeping him tethered to earth. Wolfe let him stew while he reread the letter, which I had to admit was a fine piece of curiosity. The handwriting was steady, not hysterical, the phrasing clean, like someone who knew exactly what she wanted to say. If Caroline Day had really written it, she wasn't flailing. She was announcing. Wolfe finally looked up. "You did not show this to the police?" Alcott shook his head fast enough to rattle his teeth. "They'd dismiss it. Without a body, they'd laugh me out of the precinct, and if I press it, I'll lose my job. Miss Day was—" He hesitated. "She was admired, yes, but also feared, and there are people at the house, authors, executives, who would not welcome scandal. I thought you could discreetly establish the truth." Wolfe made a sound halfway between a snort and a sigh. "Mr. Goodwin." That was my cue. "Yes, sir." "Get Mr. Alcott's particulars, names, circumstances, the company, the colleagues, confine him to the essential." Which meant I spent the next 20 minutes coaxing the basics out of a man who could turn a grocery list into a sermon. Alcott worked at Penton and Ross, a publishing house modest in size but ambitious in reach. Caroline Day, 38, had been one of their star editors, sharp, successful, and not exactly beloved. She had no family in New York. Her closest associates were a handful of authors she championed, plus a rival editor named Gregory Folsom and a senior executive, Margaret Tolland, who oversaw the fiction division. According to Alcott, Caroline was brilliant, ambitious, and had recently won a promotion that someone else expected. That someone else might not have taken it kindly. When I had enough written down to fill half a page of my notebook, Wolfe stirred. "Pfui. A woman writes a melodramatic note. She absents herself. You infer murder. Childish." Alcott flushed. "No, sir, you didn't know her. She wasn't melodramatic. She hated sentiment. If she wrote that note, it was deliberate. And if she said she would be dead, she might have meant only in spirit or socially or in employment. Words are plastic. Their shape depends on the hand that molds them." Wolfe shut his eyes. "Still, this interests me." That was the closest thing to enthusiasm Wolfe ever gave in the presence of a stranger. He was already chewing the problem in silence, which meant I had to handle the guest. "Mr. Alcott," I said, "I'll be frank. You're asking us to prove a death without a body, a crime without a scene, and a disappearance nobody else is alarmed about. You see the uphill grade, don't you?" "Yes," his voice cracked, "but she trusted me with that letter. If I do nothing and she's gone, it will be my fault." There was something in his tone that made me sit back. The man was desperate, yes, but not for himself. It was devotion of some kind, whether professional, romantic, or just guilt, I couldn't say. But Wolfe would see it too. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "Archie, accept the engagement, a retainer of $1,000, to be applied against services at my discretion. Mr. Alcott, if that sum is beyond you, then offer what you can, and I will dismiss you now. I dislike haggling." Alcott blinked as if he'd been struck. I can manage it." "Good. Then you will leave the letter. Mr. Goodwin will begin inquiries. Report here at 9 o'clock this evening with any further material you can obtain. Personal effects, correspondence, testimony. Be punctual." Dismissal doesn't need words when Wolfe delivers it. Alcott rose, clutching his briefcase like a lifeline, and I escorted him to the door. On the stoop, he muttered thanks and disappeared into the noon bustle of West 35th Street. When I returned, Wolfe had already pressed the buzzer for beer. He waited until Fritz delivered the glass and then turned it in his hand like a globe. "Archie, we are intruded upon. That's putting it mildly. This is no mere disappearance. She has arranged an absence that compels inquiry. I'm to be imposed upon by a woman I've never met, who may be alive, who may be dead, and who may be neither. Confound her. Then why take it? I asked. He gave me a glance that could have sliced through mahogany. Because, Mr. Goodwin, the prospect of a murder without a body offends my intellect. Either she has contrived a jest, or someone else has contrived her extinction. In either case, it is intolerable. That was the moment I knew the brownstone had been disturbed. Not by Alcott, not by the letter, but by Wolfe's mind getting its hooks in. Once he felt his brain was being mocked, there was no escaping the pursuit. I leaned back in my chair and tapped my notebook. So, where do I start? The office? The colleagues? Or do I try to sniff out whether this Caroline Day packed a suitcase? Begin with the company, the persons whose names Mr. Alcott supplied. Ascertain what is known of her present whereabouts. Probe delicately. Return by dinner. Delicacy is my middle name. Bah. He sipped his beer, eyes closed, as if savoring not the drink but the chase ahead. And that's how it always starts. Someone rings the bell with a scrap of oddity, and before you know it, I'm running across town collecting puzzle pieces while Wolfe sits in his chair. Assistant this time, though, it wasn't just odd. It was impossible. A murder without a body. A disappearance that wasn't officially a disappearance, and a letter that could be either prophecy or performance. As I headed out the door, I had the feeling I'd be finding more than paper to fill my notebook. The first rule of poking around in other people's business is to look like you belong there. At Penton and Ross, that meant carrying myself as if I'd been born in a swivel chair and raised on stale coffee. The publishing house sat in one of those midtown buildings that had been modern 20 years earlier and was now trying hard not to show its age. A brass directory in the lobby told me the firm occupied the 8th floor. By the time I stepped out of the elevator, I'd already adjusted my tie and put on my best impression of a man who might be there to sell paper, pitch a manuscript, or audit the petty cash. The reception area was neat but tired, with a carpet that had fought one too many battles with ink stains. Behind the desk sat a secretary who had the efficient eyes of someone who could dismiss me before I finished saying hello. I smiled and asked if Miss Caroline Day was in. The smile got me exactly what I expected, a faint frown and a shake of the head. Miss Day is away, the secretary said, her tone carrying enough finality to close a book. I leaned on the desk just enough to suggest casual curiosity. Away as in sick leave, or away as in a trip. Her lips pressed together. She's not in today. Which meant either she didn't know or she'd been instructed to say nothing. I thanked her and wandered toward the corridor as if I had an appointment. It's a trick that works more often than it should. Down the hall I spotted a glass-walled office with a nameplate, Gregory Folsom, senior editor. He was mid-40s, thin and sharp around the edges. He looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who sees an interruption as a crime punishable by exile. Yes? I strolled in. Archie Goodwin. I'm doing some follow-up on one of your authors, and I understand Miss Day was involved. Trouble is, I can't seem to reach her. The shift was subtle, but there. His jaw tightened. Miss Day is not available. Not available as in unavailable to you too? I asked, keeping my tone light. Or just unavailable to me? He gave me a look that could have been used to sterilize scalpels. She's taken some time. I don't know her schedule. Now, if you'll excuse me, I didn't budge. Funny thing, though. People usually tell me where a colleague has gone. Florida, sickbed, writer's retreat, something. You all seem remarkably vague. That earned me a flicker in his eyes. Not guilt, not yet, but nerves. He wanted me out before I pressed further. I backed off with a grin. Fair enough. Thanks for your time. Back in the hall, I ducked into the men's room and jotted notes. Folsom knew more than he was saying, and the secretary's silence had the polish of company policy. Somebody upstairs had decided the party line was, "She's away," and no one was supposed to color outside it. The next name on my list was Margaret Tolland, the executive. She had a corner office, wide windows, and a phone that looked like it could reach the Pentagon. She was in her 50s, tall, with hair pinned as tight as her schedule. She glanced up when I knocked, her eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. Yes? I introduced myself and repeated the line about following up on an author. She didn't invite me to sit. You'll need to speak with another editor. Miss Day is not available. That's what they tell me, only nobody seems to know where she is. Does that strike you as odd, Miss Tolland? Her pause was too long to be natural. Not in the least. Editors come and go. Sometimes they take retreats. Sometimes they travel with authors. This is a business that thrives on irregular schedules. True, but usually people announce where they're retreating to. A postcard, at least. She didn't smile. I'm afraid I don't have anything further for you. I left before she threw me out, but I had enough. 2 stone walls in one afternoon, both polished to the same shine. On the way back through reception, I slowed long enough to ask the secretary, "Mind if I leave a message for Miss Day, just in case she calls in?" Her hesitation was half a second too long. "You may leave it with me." I scribbled Archie Goodwin, urgent, on a slip and handed it over. I doubted it would reach Caroline, wherever she was, but it planted a seed. If she was alive and in contact, the name would travel. By the time I was on the street, I was convinced of one thing: Penton and Ross was on lockdown. Whether Caroline had vanished on her own or been pushed, the firm had decided not to acknowledge it, which meant someone there had something to lose if the truth came out. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office with his afternoon beer. I laid my notes on the desk and gave him the highlights. Vague denials, rehearsed phrases, and the strong impression that Caroline's disappearance was an open secret everyone was pretending wasn't a secret. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, nodding slightly. When I finished, he opened them and looked at me as if I'd brought him a half-cooked steak. So, she is absent, and those who should be perturbed are not. Instead, they collude in silence. Unsatisfactory. Unsatisfactory for them, maybe. For us, it smells like a job. He inclined his head. Perhaps. It is more than that. It is insolence. They presume to dictate reality by omission. Intolerable. That was Wolfe's version of blood on the water. He sat back, steepled his fingers, and said, "Archie, tomorrow you will speak with her authors. Writers are incapable of silence. They will have noticed. Meanwhile, have Mr. Alcott summoned this evening as I directed. He will answer questions under my eye," which told me Wolfe wasn't just nibbling at the bait anymore. He was setting the hook, and if Penton and Ross thought they could stonewall their way out of this, they'd soon learn what it meant to disturb the brownstone. At 9 that evening, Lawrence Alcott arrived with the punctuality of a man afraid of missing curfew. Fritz showed him into the office, where Wolfe was already planted in his chair with a bottle of beer and a glare that could have wilted orchids. I took my usual spot at the side desk, notebook open, and decided Alcott looked even more rattled than he had that morning. His tie was crooked, and he gripped his briefcase as if someone might try to wrestle it away. "You have returned," Wolfe said. He didn't add as instructed, but it was implied. "Do you have material?" Alcott sat on the edge of the red leather chair and fumbled with the latches on the briefcase. I brought a few things. Notes, mostly. She had a habit of leaving drafts of letters on her desk. I collected some of them before anyone else could, and, well, there's this. He pulled out a small envelope and placed it on Wolfe's desk like it might explode. I got up and fetched it over to Wolfe, who opened it with his paper knife. Inside was a torn scrap of stationery. In neat script, unmistakably the same as the first letter, was a single sentence. "They watch even here." Wolfe's brows dipped low. "Where did you obtain this?" Alcott licked his lips. From her wastebasket. I know it looks foolish, but when I saw it, I felt that you were intruding. Yet you intruded. Wolfe folded the scrap and set it beside the first letter. Continue. Alcott spread out a few handwritten pages. These were drafts of correspondence with authors. Nothing unusual, except she seemed distracted. Several sentences trail off mid-thought. That wasn't like her. Wolfe glanced at me, which was his way of delegating the sorting. I flipped through the pages. He was right. The drafts looked uneven, broken phrases, sentences cut short. I could imagine an editor leaving things unfinished if her mind was elsewhere. She was being pressured, Alcott said suddenly. I can't prove it, but she told me once that her promotion came at a cost. She'd made enemies. Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits. Enemies? You're being dramatic. Who? Gregory Folsom, for one. He expected the position. He was furious when she got it. And Margaret Tolland, the executive. She tolerated Caroline, but she also feared her. Caroline had a way of making people feel small. I thought back to my visit earlier in the day. Folsom hadn't exactly rolled out a welcome mat, and Tolland's composure had been too deliberate. Alcott might be coloring the truth with his own nerves, but the tension was there. Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands across his stomach. And you, Mr. Alcott? Why are you so concerned? Your attachment to Miss Day appears personal. Alcott flushed deep crimson. I admired her, yes. She was brilliant, and she was kind to me. Not many in that office bothered to notice a clerk. She did, that's all. Wolfe grunted. That is not all, but enough for now. Mr. Goodwin, recount your observations. So I laid out the day. The secretary's canned lines, Folsom's attempt to scowl me out of the room, Tolland's smooth stonewalling. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, nodding occasionally, as if filing each point in a cabinet behind his forehead. When I finished, he opened his eyes. They are complicit. Whether in her death or her concealment, they are complicit. Alcott stiffened. Then you agree? She's dead. Bah. I agree to nothing. But her absence has been choreographed. That is intolerable. Mr. Goodwin will see her authors tomorrow. You, Mr. Alcott, will refrain from agitation at your office. If they sense you are meddling, we lose advantage. Alcott nodded, clutching his briefcase. Yes, of course. Now, you will leave both letters here. If further scraps or drafts come into your possession, bring them. And above all, do not repeat to anyone that you have engaged me. Dismissal delivered, Alcott rose shakily and allowed me to escort him out. On the stoop, he muttered something about gratitude, but his eyes were distant, haunted. When I shut the door behind him, I wondered if he'd make it through the week without snapping like a dried twig. Back in the office, Wolfe was staring at the two letters as though they were slabs of marble and he intended to sculpt them into a statue. He didn't speak for a while, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he said, Archie, this is not a murder without a body. It is worse. Worse how? It is a murder without substance. A thing, made of words, arranged to unsettle, to compel action, perhaps to incriminate. Either Miss Day is an author of melodrama, or she is a victim of those who are. And you intend to find out which? His lips curved faintly. Intention is not the word. Necessity. He rang for another beer. I made a note in my book. Tomorrow, the authors. If Wolfe was right, they'd talk more freely than the buttoned-up crew at Penton and Ross. And if Caroline Day's ghost was haunting the brownstone through scraps of paper, I had the feeling we hadn't yet seen the last of her handwriting. When Wolfe raised his glass, it wasn't in a toast. It was in judgment. They believe they can erase a woman, Mr. Goodwin, as if striking a line from a page. But a page retains the impression of what was written, however faint. That is where we shall look. And with that, the house returned to its silence, broken only by the clink of glass against wood and the faint scratching of my pen. The next morning, Wolfe was in no mood for chatter. He'd come down from the orchids at 11 sharp, lowered himself into his chair, and directed me to attend the authors, as though they were livestock at an auction. I already had names from Alcott's list, and with a little phone work, I managed to line up 2 willing enough to meet me. Authors, unlike editors, don't have much practice at silence. The first was a novelist named Henry Crampton, whose latest book, Penton and Ross, had launched under Caroline Day's supervision. He met me in a cafe on Lexington, the sort of place that thought a cracked leather booth was atmosphere. Crampton was in his 50s, heavy-set, with a tired expression that suggested he'd seen one too many reviews with the word promising in them. When I mentioned Caroline, his face tightened. Haven't seen her since last week. She was supposed to go over revisions with me. Then she cancelled. No explanation. Cancelled by phone? Yes. Brief call. She sounded odd. Not sick exactly, but hurried, like someone listening for footsteps in the hall. I asked if we should reschedule, and she said she'd be in touch. She never was. I let him stew for a moment before nudging. She didn't confide in you? Mention trouble? He gave a short laugh. Caroline. She was more likely to dissect your grammar than your emotions, but she was worried about something. I could hear it. I assumed it was office politics. That place breeds them. I steered him toward specifics, but Crampton had nothing concrete, only impressions. Still, impressions can be useful. I filed away, hurried, listening for footsteps, and moved on. The second was a poet named Lucille Brand, whom I found in a cramped walk-up studio on West End Avenue that smelled like turpentine and stale coffee. She opened the door barefoot, hair tangled, and waved me in with the distracted air of someone who considered housekeeping a capitalist plot. When I mentioned Caroline, Lucille's eyes lit up. She was the only editor who ever understood my work. Everyone else wanted me to rhyme like a schoolgirl. She told me to sharpen, cut, pare down. Her voice caught. If she's gone, she may not be, I cut in quickly. But she is absent. Have you heard from her? Lucille nodded slowly. 3 nights ago, a phone call. She said only one thing. Don't trust the pages. Then the line went dead. That made me sit straighter. Don't trust the pages? She shrugged helplessly. I thought maybe she meant my manuscript. But now, you think something happened to her? I think, I said carefully, that she wanted someone to know she was in a jam. Lucille fidgeted, twisting her fingers. She had enemies, not just in the office, authors too. She rejected people brutally, told them to their face they weren't good enough. They hated her for it. Names? Too many to count, but one stands out. Russell Kent. He wrote a mystery manuscript last year. She shredded it. He shouted at her in the lobby where everyone could hear, said he'd make her regret it. That was worth noting. A man who writes mysteries and threatens editors has the kind of irony Wolfe savors. I left Lucille promising I'd keep her informed, though we both knew I wouldn't. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the day's harvest for Wolfe, who was mid-course in lunch. He hates being interrupted during meals, but he tolerates me more than most interruptions. Crampton said she sounded hurried, like she was listening for footsteps. Brand says she told her not to trust the pages. And there's this Russell Kent who had a public meltdown after she rejected him. Wolfe chewed slowly, then dabbed his lips. Pages. Words. Always words. It is intolerable. She was ensnared by them. Or using them to leave us breadcrumbs, I suggested. He gave me a glare. Metaphors are for poets, she wrote literally. Don't trust the pages. That is plain speech, however elliptical. What pages, Archie? What documents were being altered, falsified, concealed? That is the fulcrum. I had no answer, so I let silence do its work. Wolfe finally drained his beer. We shall not proceed in darkness. Tonight you will summon this Russell Kent. Bring him here. I dislike theatrics, but we must test the caliber of his enmity." "Summon," I said. "What if he tells me to drop dead?" "Then you will persuade him otherwise. Employ wit, cajolery, or menace. Suit yourself." That was Wolfe's way of telling me the evening would not be dull. I jotted the assignment in my book and leaned back, watching him reach for another bottle. "Archie," he said, almost as an afterthought, "this is no longer merely a disappearance. It is a contest. Someone believes words can erase a life. They are wrong. Words, Mr. Goodwin, preserve." And with that, he closed his eyes. Which, in Wolfe's case, meant the interrogation had already begun, inside his head. Russell Kent did not require much persuading. A man who writes mystery novels and gets them rejected tends to crave an audience, even if it's one stacked against him. When I found him in a midtown bar that smelled like varnish and defeat, he was 3 fingers into a scotch and talking too loudly to nobody. I introduced myself, slid onto the stool beside him, and mentioned Caroline Day's name. His eyes sharpened like a dull blade suddenly catching a whetstone. "Caroline?" He barked a laugh. "The Witch of Madison Avenue. Don't tell me she's decided to resurrect my manuscript." I ordered a club soda and gave him a level look. "She's gone missing." That sobered him faster than coffee. "Missing? 3 days. No word. People are pretending she's just away. I thought you'd be interested." He shifted, tugging at his collar. "Interested, sure. Surprised? Not so much. She made enemies. She shredded people. Me included. Told me my book was a patchwork of cliches." His lip curled. "But I wouldn't wish her gone. She had power. You don't just erase that." "Maybe someone tried," I said lightly. "Care to come downtown and discuss it with a man who specializes in unsolvable puzzles?" He stared, weighing me, then shrugged. "Why not? Beats drinking alone." An hour later, I had him in Wolfe's office, staring at the bookshelves like they might lunge at him. Wolfe didn't move, didn't even blink, as Kent slouched into the red leather chair. "Mr. Kent," Wolfe said, his tone the verbal equivalent of an anvil, "you quarreled with Miss Day." Kent smirked. "I quarreled with her, yes. She humiliated me in front of half the lobby. Said I didn't have a talent for narrative tension. I told her she'd regret it. Not exactly subtle." "Did she regret it?" Wolfe asked. Kent's eyes flicked down. "She didn't have time. Next thing I hear, she's vanished." "You are not perturbed?" "Why should I be? People vanish in this city all the time, especially people who climb higher than their footing allows." I cut in. "Yet you came when invited." Kent's smirk faded. "Because you're taking it seriously, and because—" He hesitated. "Because she called me." That made Wolfe's eyes open fully, which is like thunder without the lightning. "Explain." Kent ran a hand through his hair. 2 nights ago. Late. She sounded strange. Whispering. She said only one line. They're altering the story. Then she hung up. I felt a chill crawl up my back. "Altering what story?" Kent spread his hands. "No idea, but she meant it. And if you ask me, it wasn't about fiction. She was scared." Wolfe exhaled slowly, as though controlling a flame. "So, to one author she says, 'Don't trust the pages.' To another, 'They're altering the story.' Words of warning, precise but opaque." He pressed his palms together on his belly. "Mr. Kent, did she entrust you with documents, drafts, manuscripts?" Kent shook his head. "Nothing. Only that call." "Then you are of limited use." Wolfe closed his eyes. Kent bristled. "That's gratitude for you." I walked him out before Wolfe could squash him further. On the stoop, Kent muttered, "If she's really gone, I hope whoever did it is proud. They killed the only person in that office worth fearing." Then he stalked into the night. Back inside, I found Wolfe still motionless, eyes shut, fingers steepled. When he spoke, it was like listening to a man dictating to himself. She left 3 messages, to Alcott, to Miss Brand, to Kent, each couched in metaphorical terms but consistent. Pages, story, watching. She foresaw her erasure, but not in the literal sense of murder. Rather, removal, concealment, falsification. Archie, they are tampering with a record. I leaned back, whistling softly. Meaning what? Her work files? Company documents? Exactly. Something she had written or overseen. It endangered someone. So they eliminated her, or her presence. His lips thinned. Intolerable arrogance. Then what's the play? He opened his eyes. We shall strike at the nexus. You will revisit Penton and Ross. Demand access not to people but to papers, files, manuscripts, correspondence. They will resist. Note what they refuse to show. Subtle as ever, I muttered. Phooey. I'm not a burglar. You are my eyes. Observe, report. Tonight we have tested the periphery. Tomorrow we enter the core. He reached for another beer and shut his eyes again, signaling dismissal. I closed my notebook, though my brain was still buzzing. Caroline Day hadn't just disappeared. She had written her own epitaph in riddles. Pages not to be trusted, stories altered, watchers unseen. And if Wolfe was right, somewhere in a stack of papers sat the reason she was gone. The trick would be finding it before the story reached its final draft. The following morning I made my return to Penton and Ross with all the subtlety of a delivery man who'd lost the address. Wolfe hadn't told me to kick down doors, but he had told me to find papers. And when Wolfe gives an order involving ink and paper, you can bet he means something more combustible than contracts. I walked into the lobby and gave the receptionist the kind of smile that says you're either important or irritating, and possibly both. She tensed immediately, probably remembering my visit 2 days earlier. Back again, she said, lips tight. Business unfinished, I told her. Caroline Day's files. I need to see them. She blinked. Her files? That's right. Drafts, correspondence, manuscripts, whatever she left behind. I won't touch a paperclip without permission, but I do want to know they exist. Her hands fluttered over the desk. I don't think. Then fetch someone who does. She excused herself and scurried down the hall. I didn't have to wait long before Gregory Folsom appeared, his face pinched as if he'd been dragged out of a dental chair. Mr. Goodwin, he said coldly, you seem unable to take a hint. I'm a slow learner, I admitted. Miss Day's files. Where are they? He gave me a thin smile. Company property, not available for outside inspection. That's interesting, I said, leaning against the desk, because I've spoken to 3 of her authors who heard from her right before she disappeared. And they all say the same thing. Something was wrong with her work. Pages not to be trusted. Stories being altered. Now, unless you want me to assume you're the alteration committee, you'll point me toward those files. His eyes flashed. For a second, I thought he might actually grab my collar, but he controlled himself. I'll speak with Miss Tolland. Wait here. He disappeared. The receptionist looked like she wanted to vanish too. 10 minutes later, Margaret Tolland herself arrived, composed as ever, her heels clicking on the linoleum. Mr. Goodwin, she said crisply, we've tolerated your interruptions long enough. Whatever personal drama Miss Day may have involved herself in, it does not entitle you to rifle through confidential company documents. I don't want to rifle, I said. Just confirm they're intact. Her eyes narrowed. Intact? Exactly. Not shredded, not doctored. If she feared alteration, I want to know whether she meant here. Ms. Tolland folded her arms. Your insinuations are insulting. Miss Day's work is secure. If she expressed doubts, they were her own. Now I must ask you to leave. That was as far as I was getting without a badge or a crowbar, neither of which was in my pocket. I tipped my hat, thanked her sweetly, and headed back to the brownstone. When I reported, Wolfe listened without opening his eyes. They refused. Like a steel door, I agreed. That is confirmation. He took a long pull of beer. The files are the fulcrum. If Miss Day feared alteration, then the files are compromised. They resist access, not to protect privacy, but to protect themselves. Phooey. Then what now? Do I sneak back tonight and jimmy the cabinets? He glared at me. I do not employ housebreakers. We apply pressure. Whose thumbs do we squeeze? Not theirs. Authors. He gestured toward the phone. Summon them. Miss Brand, Mr. Crampton, Mr. Kent. Have them here tonight at 9 o'clock. We shall address them collectively. They will resist solitude. In chorus, they will betray. And Alcott. Include him. He is already entangled. I made the calls. Kent grumbled but agreed, probably for the drama. Crampton was hesitant, but curiosity outweighed dignity. Brand said yes instantly, with a poet's flair for conspiracies. Alcott promised he'd be punctual again, though he sounded like his nerves were strung tighter than a violin. By evening, the brownstone's front room looked like a waiting room for people who'd accidentally bought the same train ticket. Crampton sulked, Kent smirked, Brand tapped her foot, and Alcott clutched his briefcase. I ushered them all into Wolfe's office, where Wolfe sat like an idol, immovable and immense. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, Miss Day entrusted each of you with words of warning. You, Miss Brand, were told not to trust the pages. You, Mr. Kent, that the story was being altered. Mr. Alcott received the most direct message. I will be dead, and they will not allow you to find me. Taken together, these constitute a pattern. She foresaw interference with the written record of her labor. Crampton shifted uneasily. So what? Editors exaggerate. Maybe she... Silence. Wolfe's voice cracked like a whip. You are not here to minimize. You are here to assist. Miss Day's files are inaccessible. I will have them. But before I breach that wall, I require clarity. What did she edit? What manuscripts? What contracts? What words of consequence? They exchanged glances. Kent broke first. She mentioned a book, non-fiction, something about financial scandals. Said it would shake people. She was excited. Brand snapped her fingers. Yes, she hinted at it. Not one of her usual projects. Something big. Alcott swallowed. She told me too. A manuscript that scared her. She said if it was published, people at the top would fall, but she didn't name names. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. So, a book. Dangerous enough to inspire suppression. And suppression required not merely silence, but her disappearance. That is the kernel. He leaned back, fingers steepled. Archie, tomorrow you will identify the author of that manuscript. Penton and Ross will not admit it exists, but the authors will gossip. Find the name. Once we have it, we have the motive. I glanced at the 4 uneasy faces in the room. They'd come for answers, but they were leaving with the feeling they'd just been drafted. Wolfe let the silence stretch until they squirmed. Then he dismissed them with a flick of his fingers. When the door shut behind them, Wolfe murmured, "They believe they can bury a book and its editor." But the words remain, Archie. They always remain. Our task is to exhume them. And with that, he reached for another beer, as if resurrection were just another item on the day's agenda. The following day started with Wolfe glaring at his breakfast eggs as though they had personally conspired against him. He was already impatient before I put the question to him. So, I said, pouring coffee, I go hunting for an author nobody at Penton and Ross will admit exists. Do I at least get a description, or am I chasing a ghost? You have fragments, Wolfe said. Non-fiction manuscript, financial scandal, disruptive in its implications. That is sufficient. Gossip is the bloodstream of publishing. Trace it. which was his way of saying he expected me to come back with a name, a motive, and preferably a copy of the manuscript bound in leather. I started with the obvious. Authors talk to agents, and agents talk to bartenders, so by lunchtime I was in a dingy midtown place frequented by the literary set, which is to say, half the clientele wore tweed and the other half owed money. After buying 2 rounds for a man who claimed to represent half the serious novelists in America, I finally struck something useful. He lowered his glass and muttered, "If you're asking about Day's big secret, the rumor was she had her hands on a manuscript by Harold Brigham." I recognized the name. Brigham was a minor economist who had suddenly gone quiet a year earlier, right after whispering to the press that Wall Street had skeletons buried deeper than their vaults. He hadn't published since. "Brigham," I repeated, trying not to show teeth. "What was the book?" The agent shrugged. "Supposed to be an exposé, names, numbers, the kind of thing that could ruin reputations. I heard Penton and Ross was sitting on it, polishing it, deciding whether they dared." That was enough for me. I left him to his gin and headed back to the brownstone. Wolfe listened as I relayed it, his eyes closed, his lips pressed thin. Brigham. Yes, if the manuscript contained allegations of malfeasance, suppression would be inevitable. Miss Day's disappearance becomes intelligible. Someone feared she would not remain discreet. "Then she wasn't just an editor," I said. "She was the liability. She had the pages." "Precisely. And when the pages cannot be trusted, the story is altered." Her words to her confidants were exact. "Phooey, fools. They conceal her body, if body there is, but they cannot conceal their fear. They resist you because exposure looms." He tapped the arm of his chair. "Archie, we will not rely on rumor. We will have Brigham." "Which means I go knock on doors again." "Indeed, find him. Bring him here. If he has survived his silence, he will supply the final link." It took the rest of the day and 3 subway rides, but by evening I had him. Harold Brigham was holed up in a basement apartment in Queens, the kind of place where wallpaper goes to die. He was gaunt, twitchy, and smelled of old paper. When I mentioned Wolfe's name, he flinched. "I can't. Don't ask me. It's gone." "What's gone?" I asked, keeping my tone easy. "The manuscript. They took it. Caroline had it. She was working through edits. Then she called me, whispered that if anything happened, I should find—" But then the line cut. I haven't heard from her since. I leaned closer. "Find what?" He shook his head, panicked. "She never finished. Just find the original. That's all." That was good enough for me. I coaxed him into a cab and delivered him to the brownstone. Wolfe received him like a weary emperor accepting a reluctant envoy. "Mr. Brigham," he said, "compose yourself. You entrusted Miss Day with a manuscript detailing corruption." Brigham nodded miserably. "Names, banks, deals, proof. She was brave, but too open. They couldn't risk it." "Who are they?" Wolfe demanded. Brigham wrung his hands. "Executives, investors, people tied to Penton and Ross's board. Caroline said the house was compromised at the top. She feared the manuscript would vanish, rewritten into something harmless." "Ah." Wolfe's eyelids lowered. "Erasure by substitution. Not merely destruction, but falsification. That is what she foresaw." Brigham shuddered. "If she's gone, it's because she wouldn't allow it. She would never consent to altering truth." Silence hung in the office. Wolfe's face was grave, the gravity of a man already shaping the endgame. "Archie," he said at last, "we summon them. Not the authors, not the clerks, the principals, Tolland, Folsom, and whomever sits above them. They will come, though they will squirm. Tonight they believe they hold dominion over silence. Tomorrow they will find themselves compelled to speak." I knew what that meant. Wolfe's favorite stage, his office, the red chairs aligned like a courtroom. And if he had his way, the truth would come out not with fists, but with words, pried loose and laid bare. As Brigham sat trembling in the corner, I realized Wolfe was already scripting the final act. Caroline Day had warned them all, don't trust the pages. Wolfe intended to make sure the story ended on his terms, and hers. By the next afternoon, the brownstone felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage with the curtains about to rise. Wolfe had given me my marching orders before retreating to the orchids. The invitations were to go out, terse and absolute, summoning Margaret Tolland, Gregory Folsom, and the senior officers of Penton and Ross, whose names I could pry loose. The tone, Wolfe insisted, must leave no room for refusal. He dictated the wording himself, each line as sharp as a subpoena. I typed them on Wolfe's heavy cream stationery, which carried enough gravity on its own, and sent them off by messenger. By 6 o'clock, the replies had trickled back. Tolland had responded with a cool, "I'll be there," while Folsom had scribbled something that looked like reluctant compliance. One board member, a fellow named Ellery Nash, called me directly to demand why his presence was required. I recited Wolfe's line about matters of immediate consequence to your firm's integrity, and after a long pause, Nash sighed and said he would come. The trap was baited. When Wolfe finally descended for dinner, Fritz had prepared squab, and Wolfe devoted himself to the meal with the concentration of a man, fortifying himself for battle. He said little until the last bite was gone and the last drop of beer consumed. Then he wiped his lips and announced, "Tonight we lay the pattern bare." At 8:45 I ushered Harold Brigham into the front room. He looked more like a ghost than a guest, wringing his thin hands, eyes darting at every creak of the floorboards. Alcott arrived shortly after, pale but determined, carrying his ever-present briefcase as though it contained ballast for his courage. By 9 sharp, the others began filing in. Tolland entered first, composed but taut, followed by Folsom, his face set in an expression of polite fury. 10 minutes later, Ellery Nash strode in, broad-shouldered and ruddy, the kind of man who expected deference and disliked having to appear on command. Wolfe waited until they were all seated in the rows of red leather chairs facing his desk. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch until even Nash shifted uneasily. Then, at last, he opened his eyes and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because you attempted to efface a woman and a work of consequence. You failed. Miss Caroline Day, entrusted with a manuscript of perilous import, foresaw your stratagem. She warned others that pages would be altered, stories distorted, truths buried. She was correct. You sought to erase her, and with her, the record. That, sirs and madams, is intolerable." Tolland's chin lifted. "This is outrageous. You have no standing to summon us." "Silence!" Wolfe snapped. His voice was low, but it carried the force of a hammer. "I require no standing but intellect. You will listen." Nash leaned forward. "If you are implying criminality, Mr. Wolfe, I advise you to tread carefully." "Pfui, I imply nothing. I assert. The manuscript by Harold Brigham, present in this room, was delivered into Miss Day's hands. It contained allegations of corruption implicating members of your board and your associates. Instead of confronting it, you resolved to neutralize it, not merely suppress, but alter, so that the book would emerge toothless, its revelations buried beneath euphemism and omission. Miss Day refused. For that, she was silenced." Folsom barked a laugh, too loud. "You talk like a detective novel. Caroline Day is not dead. She's absent. A holiday, perhaps? Or she tired of the company?" Brigham's thin voice cut across the room. "She called me. She told me to find the original. She knew they would take it, and then she vanished." Tolland's composure faltered for the first time, a flicker of alarm. Nash glared at her, then at Folsom. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "There, observe. Your reactions betray you. You sit complicit in a fraud. If Miss Day is indeed alive, produce her. If she is not, then her death rests on your conspiracy. Either way, your maneuver has collapsed." Nash pushed to his feet, color rising. "You overstep. We owe you no answers." Wolfe didn't so much as blink. "You owe them to the law and to your own survival. I've already prepared statements for the district attorney, including the letters Miss Day left and the testimony of these witnesses. You may leave now, Mr. Nash, and face official inquiry, or you may remain and admit the extent of your interference." The room vibrated with tension. Tolland's lips pressed white. Folsom's hands clenched on his knees. Nash stood rigid, his breath heavy. Alcott, trembling, broke the silence. "You killed her," he whispered. "You erased her, just like she said." Nash rounded on him, eyes blazing. "Careful, boy." That was all Wolfe needed. He raised a hand, calm, deliberate. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "see that Mr. Nash and his colleagues do not depart until I have finished." "Gladly," I said, stepping forward. And though I wasn't armed with more than my notebook and a steady stance, I didn't doubt that Wolfe would hold them there with nothing more than the weight of his words. The web had tightened. The story was nearly complete. All that remained was Wolfe's final stroke, the act of naming guilt with the precision of a scalpel. And judging by the look on his face, that moment was seconds away. The room had the feel of a jury box without a judge, but Wolfe was judge enough for anyone. Nash's bluster was still reverberating when Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to slits. He spoke without raising his voice, but each word landed with the inevitability of a gavel. "You attempted to silence Miss Day because she possessed the unvarnished manuscript. Mr. Brigham entrusted her with it, and she was preparing it for publication. It contained, among other things, detailed transactions that implicated you, Mr. Nash, and your associates in fraudulent dealings. You and your allies in the House chose to substitute a harmless version, a pallid rewrite to preserve your fortunes. But Miss Day was incorruptible. She refused to alter the story. She told her confidants not to trust the pages. And when she resisted, you ensured her disappearance." Nash sputtered. "That's conjecture, wild conjecture." "Pfui! It is deduction," Wolfe retorted. "Your reaction just now, threatening Mr. Alcott, your own clerk, for speaking aloud the obvious, betrays you. Miss Tolland's silence is acquiescence. Mr. Folsom's laughter was defense by derision, a common refuge for the guilty when words press too near. You are entangled, all of you." Tolland stiffened, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "If you think you can accuse a publishing house executive of murder without a shred of evidence, I require no shred. I have threads enough to weave the tapestry. The evidence is circumstantial, yes, but conclusive. Consider. Miss Day left written testimony, letters foretelling her own extinction and the alteration of truth. She telephoned, both Mr. Kent and Miss Brand, with warnings. She called Mr. Brigham to say, find the original. And now, the original manuscript is missing. Only those with access to the files could accomplish that. Only those with authority could enforce the silence of the staff. Only you, Ms. Tolland, and you, Mr. Nash, could compel such erasure. Folsom tried to rise, but his knees buckled under Wolfe's glare. I didn't touch her, he muttered. I only did what I was told. That broke the dam. Tolland's mask cracked. Her lips trembled, though her eyes remained hard. She was reckless, she said bitterly. She would have destroyed us all with that book. Do you understand the magnitude? The board, the investors, it wasn't just Nash. It was survival. She wouldn't bend. She laughed at us, and so she had to be stopped. Alcott let out a choked sound. You admit it? Wolfe raised a hand, silencing him. I require no further confirmation. Miss Day is gone, and your confession suffices to link her disappearance to the suppression of Mr. Brigham's manuscript. The law will have the rest. Nash banged a fist on his knee. You can't prove she's dead. You can't prove a crime. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. No body, no crime. Childish. You underestimate the law. Disappearance, coupled with motive and confession, suffices. Your arrogance blinded you, but it does not blind me." He turned to me. "Archie, you will telephone Inspector Kramer. Deliver to him copies of the letters, the testimony of these witnesses, and a summary of this meeting. He will take it from here." I nodded, already picturing Kramer's red face when I relayed the evening's entertainment. Tolland collapsed back in her chair, her composure drained. Folsom buried his face in his hands. Nash muttered curses under his breath, but the fight had gone out of him. Wolfe closed his eyes, folding his hands over his stomach as if dismissing them all from existence. "You sought to erase words, to alter truth, to bury a woman who valued honesty above convenience. It was folly. Words are resilient. They outlive their authors, their editors, and their suppressors. You may have silenced Caroline Day's voice, but her warnings, her letters, her absence itself, they testify. You are undone by the very medium you tried to corrupt." Silence followed, broken only by the shallow breaths of those seated before him. Finally, Wolfe waved a hand. "Mr. Goodwin, show them out. The police will fetch them soon enough." I escorted the trio to the door, none of them daring to meet my eyes. Alcott and Brigham remained behind, shaken but vindicated. When the door shut on the last suspect, I returned to find Wolfe already reaching for his beer. Alcott spoke first, voice trembling. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Caroline, she'll be remembered." "She will," Wolfe said flatly, "because she inscribed herself in the record. They could not efface her without leaving the mark of their erasure. Go, Mr. Alcott. Go, Mr. Brigham. Leave your testimonies with Mr. Goodwin. The law will sort the carcass." They left quietly, their gratitude awkward but sincere. When the door closed behind them, the brownstone regained its silence. I leaned against the desk, notebook shut, and let out a long breath. Well, that's that. A murder without a body. I didn't think you'd pull it off. Wolfe's eyes opened, calm and heavy. "Mr. Goodwin, there is no such thing as a murder without a body. The body is always present. Sometimes it is flesh, sometimes paper, sometimes silence itself. They murdered her presence, her authority, her words. That suffices." I grinned, shaking my head. "Trust you to make poetry out of paperwork." "Bah," he muttered, reaching for his glass. "It is not poetry. It is truth. And truth, Archie, is the most resilient of bodies." Fritz entered then, announcing dinner. The aroma of roast beef wafted through the air, cutting the tension like a blade. Wolfe heaved himself upright and made his way to the dining room without another word. I lingered a moment, staring at the 2 letters still on his desk, Caroline Day's last messages. She had known she was walking into the dark, but she left her words behind, and in Wolfe's hands, words were more than enough. I followed Wolfe into dinner, shaking off the weight of the evening. The brownstone was quiet again, order restored, the case resolved with nothing more violent than truth exposed. Wolfe sat, knife and fork ready, the corners of his mouth twitching with something almost like satisfaction. For him, it was simple. The game had been played, the lie had been uncovered, and dinner was served. For me, it was another reminder that in Wolfe's world, words were sharper than bullets, and justice could be delivered from a chair without lifting more than a finger. And with that thought, I poured myself a glass of wine and let the case of the murder without a body fade into the silence of the brownstone, where, as always, Wolfe had the final word.